In a series of short explorations, we try to get an impression of the dynamics in the field of pilgrimages in Europe. And the label of our project is Reinventing Pilgrimage in Europe. And today our guest is Professor John Eade. Professor Eade is professor for sociology and anthropology at Roehampton University in London, but also visiting professor at Toronto University. And he is one of the most prominent, and I may add, most productive scholars in the field of pilgrimage research. In many books, articles, lectures, research projects, he is looking for new itineraries, new ways of approaching the global phenomenon of the pilgrimage ritual. And on his agenda is constantly exactly our theme, the process of reinventing, reframing and recasting the ritual of pilgrimage. And I also have to note that he is not only an expert on pilgrimage in the UK, but his interest is global and strongly comparative oriented. He's one of the initiators of many international conferences and networks of pilgrimage research. He also will be our expert guest in our concluding expert meeting on November the 19th. But now in this session, he is our informant for the UK primarily. Professor Eade, let us first have a look on what is happening in the UK in the field of pilgrimages. And we are interested in a general overview of the current situation. And when you focus on a country like the UK, you have pilgrimages from that country and pilgrimage in the country itself. And let's start with the international pilgrimage traveling. Are British people still traveling to Rome, Assisi, the Holy Land, and Lourdes?
Yes, very much so. In terms of Catholics, there's been a long established Catholic pilgrimages from the early 20th century, going to places like Rome, Santiago de Compostela, but also Lourdes, where I have particularly been working as a helper. Those groups are, in spite of the pandemic, still operating. But also, as you know, through the Protestant Reformation, pilgrimage shrines were destroyed in the 16th century. But there's been a very interesting revival of pilgrimage, of religious pilgrimage. I'm speaking now specifically about religious pilgrimage amongst Anglicans particularly. And I suppose Walsingham, which is a small village in Norfolk in eastern England, is a very interesting place because it has a shrine, a Church of England Anglican shrine right in the middle, which was developed in the 1920s by the Anglo-Catholic or High Church priest there, Father Patton. And a mile outside there is the Catholic shrine as well. So you have Anglicans and Catholics close to one another, but also there's an Orthodox shrine. So you have Orthodox, Catholic, and Anglican in the same place. But I suppose also we have to think about the way that pilgrimage has been more broadly interpreted. I know we're going to come to this a bit later, but many people go to Rome and they might think of themselves as a mixture of pilgrims, tourists, depending on what conversation is raised. So, and Assisi too. So I think we're going to be talking a lot about this complicated relationship between pilgrimage and tourism and travel.
Yeah. You mentioned the Camino to Santiago de Compostela in a lot of research on pilgrimage.
Yes.
I see the terminology of Caminozation. What do you think of this terminology used for a specific approach of pilgrimage in Europe?
Well, I mean, it's a useful label, I suppose. I'm a bit cautious about it because it could be used in a rather overgeneral or even superficial way. You know, I think that there's clearly a European network, particularly amongst the Catholic churches, to popularize Camino routes from Poland, the Baltic states, etc., funneling down to northern Spain. And I was in Poland a month ago, and suddenly I saw a waymark, you know, saying, pointing to Compostela, 2,000 miles away. So clearly these routes are being invented and waymarked, and people are encouraged to use them. But when I think of the problems of trying to develop it further than simply signposting, there's a lot to be done. When you think in northern Spain, you know, local communities, municipalities, etc., have a whole infrastructure linked to the tourism board in Galicia, and of course it's linked to Galician kind of identity too, of course. Whereas in the case of the UK, they're trying to promote the so-called old route from Southampton to Canterbury, and trying to get local churches and parishes involved. But this is going to be a massive project, and of course lots of parishes don't have the infrastructure that they have in northern Spain. So basically, you know, it's a great idea, it's an influential idea. There's some kind of signposting and infrastructure going on, but there's a long way to go to call it Caminoization in the sense of the Camino in northern Spain.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's have a look on the UK situation.
Yes.
As far as I can see it, the initiative of the British Pilgrimage Trust seems for me an important step in the development of regional and national pilgrimage paths in the UK. The interesting slogan of the British Pilgrimage Trust, reinventing the walk, by William Parson and Guy Hayward. Am I right if I see that you are not saying that the British Pilgrimage Trust is coming out of the blue in 2014? There was a history of the initiative of the British Pilgrimage. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, on the history?
Yeah, yes. I mean, in terms of religious, well, of course, then again, we get the issue of defining terms. So a lot of people talk about spiritual pilgrimage because they don't want to be too narrow. They want an inclusive approach, basically. So there's a kind of suspicion about making it too religiously institutionalized around the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church. So there's been a widening of vision and terminology, if you like. But also, I think in practical terms, certainly in the 1990s, we see the beginning of organization linked, actually promoted. The patron was Prince Philip, the Queen's consort, who died recently. So there's a massive kind of elite support linked to the established church, the Church of England. This is called the Sacred Britain Project, and it was trying to encourage people's sensitivity to nature, to landscape. It showed the kind of debates we're having now about climate change, you know, our responsibility for the environment, the whole notion of ecological awareness. And so they didn't want just to focus on churches and cathedrals, but to have a broader sense of the landscape. And the British Pilgrimage Trust has built on that. And of course, in a way, it's a misnomer because it's mostly the English Pilgrimage Trust. There aren't many routes in Wales and Scotland, which we might consider a bit later on. But just to finish on that, the first kind of major pilgrimage was not a religious one. It was the Jarrow Crusade, where unemployed miners walked from Jarrow in northern England down to Westminster in 1936 to highlight the issues of poverty and unemployment. So that was, if you like, the first kind of English pilgrimage, but of a secular nature. So this kind of religious and spiritual pilgrimages have developed more recently from the 1990s onwards.
Yeah, I have the impression that the British Pilgrimage Trust is really a success. Is that right, or is it the public relations of the website that gives me that impression?
They're very good at their technical stuff, and they're encouraging not just groups of people but individuals to get on their sat nav and their phones. And I went on a pilgrimage actually before the pandemic, which took us across a pre-Christian landscape near Stonehenge, which is a fascinating landscape. Guy Hayward was, using his phone to communicate with people, and so that they're very technico savvy. And that one was very interesting because there was Guy, who's a former Cambridge choral scholar who did a thesis on music and pilgrimage, and a druid, and a young woman who ran a crystals therapeutic center in Notting Hill. So it showed that kind of inclusive approach that they're trying to promote.
Yeah, in this context, it's interesting. You wrote an article recently where you compare this walk of the British Pilgrimage Trust. You participated, it was a one-day pilgrimage route, with your experiences in Lourdes. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How does this match?
Yeah, well, I began working at Lourdes as a helper when I was at university in the 1960s. So, and I went on a yearly basis with the Oxford University Catholic pilgrimage, and then it joined up with Cambridge. So I went there for 24 years. Each year I'd go there to work as a helper. So I got very drawn into Lourdes and to the whole pilgrimage scene from a Catholic point of view. And then I had a 21-year break, and then I went back again because I was writing about pilgrimage. So I thought, well, I need to go back and do more pilgrimage. I can't just write about it. I must do it. So I went back, but then I thought, well, in a way, it's getting more and more difficult because I work as a helper, lifting people, and I began to think, well, maybe those days are finished now. And so when I saw the British Pilgrimage Trust, I thought, oh, that'd be really interesting to go on and see how they do it. And then the paper developed in a way of trying to understand these very different ways of doing pilgrimage.
Yeah.
Particularly because that one was pre-Christian, so it really challenged my kind of religious upbringing, if you like.
A religious perspective, yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, pilgrimage, that's an open door, is very complex. It's a layered practice. And but it becomes interesting, I think, when we enter that open door and map some of these layers. Allow me to mention some of these dimensions of modern pilgrimage and have some comments from your side. And the first terminology I often encounter in pilgrimage research, in current pilgrimage research, is the heritization, is the notion of heritage. The scholars are tracing that the current pilgrimage in Europe and UK, I don't know, heritage is an important aspect. Do you recognize that? How do you see that in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, interesting enough, the British Pilgrimage Trust have recruited one of their workers from the English Heritage organization. So they're trying to make links with established organizations that are concerned with the maintenance of buildings, basically. all the castles and churches and cathedrals and heaven knows what that we have. So so this is clearly an attempt to try and understand the past. It obviously links to the quite a tricky relationship between heritage and history. A lot of historians are very sniffy about heritage, so they think it's commercialized nonsense really compared to what they're doing. They're doing the real stuff. So there's a kind of tension between what's called heritage, promoted through tourism agencies and other agencies, and the kind of academic history. But leaving that aside, what interested me was drawing on my work on global migration, which you mentioned at the beginning, was how the danger of suggesting national heritage is fixed and always about the past, because clearly, as we know, history is constantly being reinvented, societies are changing all the time. And the pilgrimage scene in Britain is being changed by global migration, by immigration, by Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, who are all developing their own pilgrimage places. So there's a temple, for example, in mid-Wales. You'll be walking along a lane and suddenly you see this temple in mid-Wales where you wouldn't expect to see it at all. There's a shrine to a Muslim saint in the Midlands near Coventry. There's a Buddhist temple in Scotland. So these are all signs of the way that our heritage is changing, and our understanding of it must be multi-dimensional, rather than talking all about the Vikings or the Saxons or whatever.
But you mentioned the Celtic, the Vikings. I have the impression that, for instance, in Ireland and Scotland, but perhaps also in the UK in general, that this past and perhaps this invention of tradition plays an important role in these new parts of the British Pilgrimage Trust. Am I right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is also linked to Romanticism, which can go back certainly in the 19th century. So, for example, Scottish, the whole issue of tartans and clans and all that kind of thing is very much a kind of 19th century invention. But that doesn't mean that it's not very important. When you say it's invention, it's somehow might appear to be dismissing it. No, these are very powerful images and very powerful constructions linked to identity. And I think the Celtic, the attraction of Celtic Christianity is that it's seen as somehow more indigenous, which of course itself is a problem, because where do we start the history? Do we start it with the end of the Ice Age or whatever? So there's always a problem of starting the narrative. But anyway, the idea is that the Celtic Christianity was freer, in a sense more close to nature. It was not so centralized in the Roman system. So it's kind of seen as a kind of anti-Rome, anti-institutionalization, anti-control, if you like. And also some of these monasteries, female monks and male monks lived together. So there wasn't the kind of very sharp separation around male celibacy and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. In studies, I encounter a lot of interest into what is called Wicca or New Age, or the studies of Anna Vedele Bowman, Jenny Butler in Ireland.
Yeah.
Is that reflecting the real practice of pilgrimage interest in the field? Is there a lot of interest also in pilgrimage paths for this kind of approaching nature and landscape and springs and trees and that kind, and animals?
I think there is, tracking back to my earlier comments about the Sacred Land Project and this general development of ecological awareness and sensitivity to nature. One of the course problems, as we know, of doing research is that when you're on a walk with people, you can't necessarily start interrogating them. So in my 2 walks, certainly the second walk, where we walked across the landscape from a small village near the coast of southern England across to Winchelsea and then to Rye, which are small, very interesting medieval settlements. I could only observe what people were doing. You know, I didn't feel it was fair to start trying to kind of do interviews with them. But so I was really wondering, who were people on the walk, you know, and this, again, this is the issues about definition, you know. Some people might dismiss this as simply a nice afternoon walk, you know, across the pleasant countryside. But of course, our job is to try and understand what motivates people. And as I say, this is something that I would have to do in a more rigorous way in the future. But the brief chat we had in Winchelsea churchyard, there was a kind of wedding going on. There were some of the people asking me, you know, who are you and why are you here and things like that. And so I was talking a bit about my religious background and my interest in pilgrimage. And I could see people thinking, well, you know, he's got a view a bit different from ours, but it hasn't gone much further than that.
I'm looking at the time.
Yes,
I have one question, and then I can ask if you have something missed that we raised. Perhaps I'm interested in the role of Corona, the COVID-19 pandemic,
yes.
on pilgrimage.
Yeah.
Is there an emergence of virtual pilgrimage, virtual walks? What's your impression in the UK for that?
Yes, I mean, the British Pilgrimage Trust kept going through their skill in virtual communication. So, and now, of course, they're able to kind of build on that. So, but of course, you know, as we know, people want to do what they define as the real thing. You know, so although virtual communication keeps things going, keeps you in interest. That's why I went on this walk, because at last we were free to actually, you know, walk together and talk together. You know, that kind of Chaucer's famous Canterbury Tales, where people talking to each other as they walk along. So yes, so and of course, Lourdes, for example, has a 24-hour 24/7 webcam, so you can watch what's going on at the shrine, at the grotto all the time, see all the ceremonies. And again, you know, I'm part of a Facebook Lourdes link, so I get a lot of information and videos to keep the interest. But again, of course, people are saying, you know, when can we actually go there? And
yeah, to the real thing. We need to close this interview,
yes.
But perhaps there is one thing, an aspect we did not address, and that for you is still important to mention. Perhaps there is.
Yes, I think it's the role of volunteers, because I know that, for example, the Society of St. James Compostela have been very active as a voluntary organization. So I think the kind of free time people give, Lourdes, for example, you know, people spend a lot of money, a lot of time and effort going there. So the role of volunteering hasn't really been explored sufficiently. So I'm currently working on a paper with Mario Katic in Croatia on this, and it's very interesting that this hasn't really been looked at very closely.
Yeah. Okay. Many thanks for your information and many thanks for your time.
Yeah.
And we see you in our expert meeting, November the 19th.
November. Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Paul.
Bye.
Thanks, Peter. Bye-bye.